Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of the Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now.
Good evening to you all. Welcome back to the Global Markets Encounter after 3 months of break. Before we start, let us go over a few housekeeping issues so that we know how to go around the system. First of all, we should note that the session is being held in English and French. So to select the language of your preference, you will see at the bottom right corner, interpretation. Click on it and select the language you want to hear the whole session in. Again, we are live on MS Teams, Facebook, and YouTube. So you can also equally reach us there on any of those networks. For questions or needs for clarification, please use the Q&A chat or the Q&A function, the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom. So beside interpretation, you will find Q&A, and that is the feature you have to use. Then also to tell us about your business or to network, then we have the chat functionality, which is also next to the Q&A. So anything you want to do, you want to chat, you want to network, use the chat functionality. If you have a question for us or a need for clarification, the Q&A, and if you want to select your language, use interpretation. Let me now welcome you once again to the ACA Cashew iForums. And today's topic is a year unlike any other. Impact and outlook 10 months on. So you've heard about 10 months of the coronavirus. We have been coming your way with all the learnings through the iForums. And today we are going to consolidate all the knowledge and the observations and learning that we have made over the period, and then to see what the outlook will be like from now on. So without wasting much of your time, it is my honor to invite Jim Fitzpatrick, our able cashew expert, to take us through this session. So Jim, I see your screen is already on. Kindly take over from here.
Thank you, Ernest. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our fora. We're going to talk about, obviously, we're going to talk about the cashew market, but we're also going to talk about the impact of the coronavirus and where we stand today compared to 10 months ago when this thing first started to have an impact on the cashew market. So let's have a look, first of all, at the impact and the current situation. Here's a map from Johns Hopkins University in the United States. The yellow dots show the incidence of coronavirus reported as at the middle of October. And you can see Europe and the United States, India and Latin America most heavily affected. Let's have a look at some of the cashew regions and how they stand right now. If we look at Vietnam, Vietnam has fared rather well. It's managed to control the virus. The cashew sector has continued to function. Exports are at record levels, and imports of RCN are down compared to last year. If we look at India, a very different situation. India has been heavily impacted by the coronavirus. It has had lockdowns, releases, regional lockdowns, and all of the impacts of the coronavirus. Demand, I'm told, is steady in India now, perhaps not where we would like it to be at this time of year, but nonetheless recovering. Imports of RCN are down. It's difficult to project exactly where they'll finish. I'm thinking about 15% down by the end of the year. And the exports of cashew kernels from India until the end of August in 2020 are down by 23%, which is quite significant. If we look in African countries, fortunately, Africa has been less impacted. Africa has a much lower fatality rate than other parts of the world. But the coronavirus has had an impact on business. Indeed, Africa has confounded the expectations of many experts who predicted a very heavy impact. As we look at it now, the exports of raw cashew nuts from West Africa have been much slower over the course of the year, and indeed lower. Exports are down from most countries. There are some exceptions. Benin, for example, has essentially exported and managed its entire crop. This has left some balances of RCN in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, certainly in Guinea-Bissau and probably in Nigeria too. East Africa, the crop is just beginning. There's a good crop forecast for Tanzania, and I'll talk a little bit about Mozambique later, but a very high crop forecast, but frankly a situation which is far from clear. If we look more at the countries that buy cashew nuts, China is back to normal. I mean, in terms of the impact of coronavirus on imports of cashew kernels to China, the impact was all felt at the very beginning during the lockdown, during the early weeks of this pandemic's impact on the cashew market. There was a loss of about 4,000 tons of New Year exports from Vietnam to China. And today, if we look at Chinese import figures for the year, you can see, excepting those 4 or 5 weeks when there were no exports from Vietnam, Chinese imports have recovered. And if you leave that particular part of the year out, you could even say that demand is higher than it was in the previous year. So it's back to normal. As was said at the time, those weeks of loss of shipments, they will never come back. That demand will not be repeated, but at least demand is quite positive in China now. If we look in Europe, Europe has been very heavily affected by the pandemic. Much more so in the southern European countries than in the northern European countries, but also countries like the UK have been very badly affected. Demand has been very strong. Demand remains very strong. And this trend in demand didn't start in the pandemic. This is not pandemic-driven demand. This is continuing a trend which first started to show last year, before we even knew about the coronavirus. The United States also very heavily impacted. Here we saw a remarkable spike in demand in the first and second quarters of the year. That's settled down a little bit now, and it's returned to what I would call steady growth. You would have to say that US demand has been showing fairly slack growth over the last 5 years, but this year will be different, and we will have to see how that fares next year. Certainly the lower prices will drive demand in the United States. But it may be that the spike in growth rates on cashew consumption in the United States is actually, in contrast to Europe, is actually due to the pandemic conditions. East Asia is an important growing market for cashew kernels. So if we consider East Asian countries excluding China, imports are up 13% from Vietnam in 2020, and demand looks quite steady. So overall demand in 2020 has been positive. Demand has been growing despite the restrictions on supply chain and the difficulties of the pandemic. The impact has been much more felt in the supplying countries, in Africa particularly, where we have a disruption to the supply chain, slower shipments and less volume. Really, I think when we look at it, 3 factors made the difference. Bear in mind that back in February, people were predicting disaster. They were predicting a collapse in demand. Every second Vietnamese broker was predicting that people would stop eating cashews. Prices crashed. But 3 factors made the difference. Number 1, Vietnam was lightly affected. The cashew factories remained open. Imagine, if you will, a situation where Vietnamese cashew factories were closed this year. If, for example, the Vietnamese cashew factories had been in the difficult position that the Indian cashew processors found themselves, there would be likely still 1 million tons of RCN left in Africa. So fortunately, Vietnam was lightly affected. The factories remained open. The less severe impact of the pandemic in Africa meant that although it was disrupted, RCN export continued. Some countries better than others. Benin, I've mentioned. Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, fine, really, in terms of the constraints of 2020. Guinea-Bissau, Burkina, other countries may have had a more difficult time. We'll also have a look at that a little bit later. And the third factor is, of course, demand. The fact that demand remains strong, indeed very strong. And those three factors essentially kept the cashew market rolling. And the question now is, how will that continue? How will demand continue? What will be the longer term impact of the pandemic? So let's try and reconstruct 2020. Let's have a look at how this 10 months has developed. If we go back to January, February, during the first signs, we saw a halting of buying in China, and many people drew the conclusion that that would also follow elsewhere. At that time, when we entered this crisis, the market had been expected to firm. Prices had worked their way down to around about $3.10 FOB for 320s. People were looking at it thinking, this is great value. These are 5-year lows. Consumption is buoyant. This could be a platform on which to build into the future. Good crops were predicted, particularly in Vietnam and Cambodia. And during February, Vietnamese exports started to spike, probably in a reaction to expected supply chain disruption. We saw a remarkable increase in exports during February. March and April were the months of probably the greatest concern. There was panic selling. In fact, there wasn't very much selling. There was attempts to panic sell as prices were crashed down from Vietnam. Down at one point, 320s briefly reached about $2.50. But exports continued very strong. Demand and shipments continued very strong. And retail, at one point during these months, retail sales of cashew nuts in parts of Europe were up by 50%. It was a huge turn toward nuts and nuts products during this period. As the year continued, the emphasis changed for most people. We started to get more and more concerned about the supply chain impact, how it would be organized, that in actual fact, the impact of the pandemic on the market would not be a crisis of demand. It would in fact be a crisis of supply. And questions started to be asked about, would the crops be harvested in West Africa? Would the crops be harvested in India? The supply chain crisis naturally enough caused business to become very quiet, particularly on RCN. It discouraged kernels buyers in the sense that they were shipping as much as they could accept, but at the same time they were asking questions about what will happen in the second wave, what will be the economic impact of restrictions, of lockdowns, of many people not going to work in destination markets. In July and August, this started to turn a little bit, and the more kernels buying came into the market. We still were seeing record exports from Vietnam, and in many destinations, record imports. The RCN trade started to pick up. Vietnamese company T&T Group picked up a big volume in Côte d'Ivoire to virtually assure them that their entire crop would be shipped in 2020. And the year developed. Question marks started to raise about demand in India. Not so much would there be demand in India, but to what extent the festival season would mark a recovery in demand. To what extent this period that we're now in, end of October coming into November, would be an important period for buying in India, and whether or not we would see demand. I think we always reckoned demand would be down in India this year, but by how much would it be down? Now we're into a position where, as West African shipments have virtually ceased, as the focus turns to East Africa, there is a question with regard to the supplies of RCN until we come to new crop in February. During this period, what we've seen is tending to be an exaggeration of the strengths and weaknesses of the supply chain. So we've seen a development of the long-term demand trend. We've seen spikes in demand. We've seen record exports from Vietnam. Really what we've seen is a continuation of the trends that were already there in 2019, but magnified by the impact of the pandemic. Certainly the impact in the early part of the year was to throw the market into a certain amount of confusion, with a lot of concerns about the supply of RCN. But it was a strange situation where actually the market could see that the main concern was supply by the time we got to May. It continued to sell at low prices, which actually was a disincentive to supply, but did cause RCN prices throughout the year to stay at levels that are relatively low compared to what might be described as the actual value of the kernels, as opposed to this, what I think is essentially a false market, which didn't reflect either demand or supply on cashew kernels during the early part of the year. If we look at that and look at the impact on prices in the course of the year, you can see, so you have here a chart with WW320 FOB prices during 2020. You have a high-low bars and just joined together to make a trend. So what we see is initially a big drop in prices. So the top of the bar is essentially what a top processor would sell, maybe a processor with a good food safety certification would sell for a forward position, and the bottom of the bar might be a small, less reliable processor, probably for prompt shipment, and one of those suppliers that really, when you buy from them, you take your chances. If the market goes up, you may not get the product. And what we saw was prices crashed, and then they started to stabilize. And we saw at various times during the year, and I always like to look at this, the difference between the top processor for forward and the smaller or less reliable processor for a nearby position can give us signals. And sometimes we see when these differences become very wide, it's a signal that prices are going to move up a little bit. And conversely, when they become very narrow, sometimes it's a signal that prices are about to fall. And right now we're in a position where the differential between the top processor offering for a forward position, perhaps first half of next year, compared to a small processor with something that needs to be moved right away, is wide. And that may be a signal. I'm not saying I absolutely believe in this idea, but it may be a signal that, combined with other factors, that the market is slightly undervalued at the moment. Fundamentally and long term, the market is almost certainly undervalued. But how quickly that will reverse remains to be seen. So let's ask the question, so why did prices crash? And let's again remind ourselves of what happened. Early in the year, prices dropped by 19% at a time when the supply of raw material was disrupted. The demand for kernels was at record levels. Processing capacity in India and in Vietnam was reduced, and the cost of processing increased. The market actually did directly the opposite of what the fundamentals suggested it should do. And if we look at it, I think there are a few reasons, which we've discussed in this forum before. Let's look at them again. The initial panic, poor information about how the market would react, what the position was in the market. A misread of the cashew consumption patterns in Western countries. The idea that some remarkable ideas were posted at the time with regards to how markets in Europe and the United States would react to the pandemic. And the assumption that what had happened in China, which was 4 to 5 weeks of zero trade on cashews from Vietnam, would be repeated around the world, which of course never happened. In fact, the opposite happened. It probably suited some people. There was probably a situation where processors in Vietnam had significant volumes to buy. I mean, if you think about it, Vietnam imports more than 80% of the raw material it processes. So if you've got, as a processor, if you've got a good sale position going forward and you need to buy probably 1.4 million tons of RCN at that time, something in that region anyway, a lower market price is helpful. You've very little to sell in that position. Seeing the market goes down is no harm. There was a hangover of Tanzanian raw material. We'll come back to that from 2018 crop and 2019 crop, and that too has had an impact. It's, as I've said, it suited many of the strongest actors that prices would fall, and I think there was probably a certain amount of tit for tat, delaying of high price contracts from buyers in order to manipulate the situation, and perhaps we're seeing the opposite of that right now from some of the processors who sold at the low prices. And most significant as well, and we shouldn't forget this, is that the lack of processing capacity in the growing countries in West Africa is a huge impact on how the market behaves. So the concern was supply chain, which means that we had a difficulty, recognized difficulty, moving well over 1 million tons from West Africa to India and Vietnam. In the conditions of the pandemic, this weakness in the supply chain was magnified. It was not clear at any point until perhaps the middle of May whether or not product would move and how badly West Africa would be impacted by the coronavirus. Thankfully, countries in West Africa have not been hit badly and governments have managed it quite well. So focusing on demand and looking at the US market, looking here, you'll see a chart on US monthly imports. What's noticeable in this is not only the red bars, which show a really huge first half of 2020 in imports, but if you look also at the grey bars, you'll see that during the second half of 2019, there was significant growth in demand compared to the previous year. December, November, October, September, right back August even, and July. So back as far as July of 2019, we were seeing year-to-year comparative growth in US demand, and that continued into 2020. Now, it was probably much more than it otherwise would have been if there were no pandemic, but it has impacted US imports. So US imports at one time this year were up 17% on 2019. That's moderated a little bit mid-year, and we're now looking at a situation where, following a low level of imports in August, that the figure is 9.3% up on the year, which is the fastest growth for 5 years. It's not over. If we look at shipments from Vietnam to the United States in September, we see an increase of 12% on the previous year. So I think we can probably look for a strong end to the year in the United States. It has been the development of the demand in the United States, according to some buyers I've spoken to recently there, has been very difficult to predict. It's come in waves, it's come in spikes, it's ebbed, and it's flowed. So I think it wouldn't be surprising if we saw a strong end to the year in the United States. And I would imagine that next year, given the lower prices, we could see continued growth in demand in the United States. Now, put 9.3% growth in perspective. If you look back over the last 5-6 years, growth in the US market has only been in the range of 0.5% to 2%. It has not been a fast-growing market. If we look in the European Union, we see something slightly different. The European Union has been showing strong growth in cashews for some time. If we look on much stronger rates than the United States, I mean, if we look at the blue bars compared to the grey bars. So this chart again is monthly imports into the European Union over 3 years, 18, 19, and 20. So if we look at the blue compared to the grey, you can see strong trends in demand, particularly toward the end of 2019. This was continued into 2020. some of the figures are absolutely remarkable. Currently the European imports are up 10% year on year. That figure is remarkable because it follows on from a year where imports were up by 9%. 9% followed by 10%. This is extremely fast growth compared to the United States, averaging 0.5 to 2% over the last 5 years. We see in Europe 15 consecutive months of growth. And this, as I say, started long before we ever heard of COVID-19 and is likely to continue. And some of the figures, I almost hesitate to talk about some of the shipment figures currently seen in the Vietnamese customs figures, because the strength of shipments during September is quite remarkable. So I expect a strong finish to the year in Europe. I wouldn't be surprised if overall European imports finished more than 10% up on the year. The yellow bars, by the way, are predictions based on shipments. So the yellow for August is based on shipments made in June and July. We don't have those figures officially yet. And the September figures are based on July and August shipments from Vietnam or from India to countries in the European Union. I expect that these blue lines will be surpassed in the last quarter, and we'll see a very strong year in Europe. And I expect that because this is not a coronavirus trend. This is based on consumer choices, based on trends in the market, and I would expect that will continue well into 2021. I took a basket to give us some idea of, let's say, the general global trend in demand. I took a basket of the 25 top import countries from Vietnam. So in order that we have the most up-to-date information, we look at shipment information. So shipment information is always ahead of import information. So we looked at the 25 top import countries, and we broke them into the 5 regions. When we look, we see that in each region, up to the end of September, we're talking here, we see significant growth, with the exception of China from Vietnam, of course, due to those 4 or 5 weeks. But if we look Asia, Oceania, excluding China, we see significant growth. Europe, as I've said, even the Middle Eastern market, which was severely disrupted. Now, we have to slightly temper this with the fact that Indian exports are strongly down, and people are replacing Indian products with Vietnamese products. That's a particular trend in East Asia. It's a trend also in the Middle East. And that may well mean that these figures are slightly overstated, but I don't think by too much. I think that we're seeing a generally strong demand trend across the markets, and that this is likely to continue. And I think we should also bear in mind that in markets where formal modern retail prevails, North America, Europe, many countries in Asia, we haven't really seen the lower prices impact on consumer choices yet. When those lower prices kick in, we would expect to see further developments in demand, particularly in North America. I want to look a little bit at Vietnam. Vietnam is the major supplier, is the major exporter of cashew kernels. India is a huge processor, but India consumes most of the cashew kernels that it processes. Vietnamese imports remain down on 2019, about 15% down to the middle of October. They have been consistently down between 15 and 18% since March, which is indicative, on the one hand, of better crops in Vietnam. The question we have to ask ourselves is the Vietnamese crop higher by 200,000 tons on the previous year, plus the additional exports? Because as I've said, exports from Vietnam of kernels are up by about 12%. And when we look at this, here's a kind of a graphic of a balance sheet. So this balance sheet attempts to calculate the position in Vietnam in the coming months. And I've taken it out to February 2021, because obviously cashew kernels that are exported in January or February come from current crop imports or from stock and not from new crops in Cambodia or Vietnam. So if we look at the situation, we look at a remarkable export figure, as we've talked about. Stock calculates, and I've taken a figure of 450,000 tons for the Vietnamese crop, which personally I think is a generous figure. I've struggled to believe figures much higher than that, although they were mentioned, particularly back at the World Cashew Conference in February. If we look at the stock, it's about, Vietnam processes about 160,000 tons a month. So you're looking on a stock of somewhere in the region of 7-8 weeks right now. That would be plus any bonded or transit stock not yet recorded in the figures. That would mean that Vietnam would need, if exports were to slow down again back to the levels of 2019, in other words, if second half of October, November and December exports were exactly the same as 2019, and if that were to continue for January and February, Vietnam would need about 380,000 tons. If the figures were to continue as they have been, that increases to about 425,000 tons. Now, it is possible that exports could slow, and many people think they will. Personally, I don't. I think they will stay very strong towards the end of the year. And then we have to look at where are the sources of that material. We know that Tanzania and Indonesia have new crops coming along. The Tanzanian auction is underway. Cote d'Ivoire has a certain amount of stock. Guinea-Bissau, well, shipments are difficult, but there would be still some raw cashew nuts left there. And there are bonded stocks in Vietnam. And it may be, and I expect to hear very soon, that there will be predictions of an early crop in Cambodia or Vietnam. The need to buy is related to the information received, so expect that news to come out anytime soon. So for me, although I don't see any major shortage arising on RCN based on this analysis, I think that the market for RCN will remain tight. I don't think that there's a prospect of lower prices for raw cashew nuts. Having said that, I don't think there's a prospect of any major squeeze on RCN later either. Let's have a look at the situation in India. India's imports, having started the year very strong, because they had major imports from Tanzania earlier in the year. Indians bought a lot of Ghanaian cashews, they bought a lot of cashews from Benin, and the position was quite positive early in the year. In fact, it was up, as I've noted there, 41% at the end of May. Today, it's down about 9% on 2019, but so is demand likely to be down in India. So we ran a similar scenario, and you'll notice that India is all about domestic use. India's exports of cashews have declined quite a lot. So if we look at India, and I ran just two simple scenarios, that demand would be down by 15%, or that demand was down by 25%. In both cases, India's need is relatively modest. Clearly, if demand is down by 20%, by 25%, India probably doesn't actually need to buy any more material in terms of tons, although you would always expect Indian buyers to look to Tanzania for some high quality raw nuts. I think that Indian imports in 2020 will be down. I think that what's left is maximum 125,000 tons. We'll know, I think, as the festival season transpires and we get some more reports back, we'll know that. It's been a hard year for Indian processors. Prices of RCN are still, although they've moderated a little bit in the last couple of weeks, they're still relatively steady. And Indian buyers still need to buy something. Again, this is to take us through to new crop. And it might be interesting to note, actually, that if Indian balances by the end of this current year are low in terms of stock of RCN, we could see quite an interesting engagement of Indian buyers early in the season. In 2021, probably focused on Benin and Ghana as usual, where they look to buy high quality raw nuts for early shipment. Looking at Africa, well, the season in West Africa has come to an end. I suppose the three notable things I would say are a record crop in Cote d'Ivoire, meaning Cote d'Ivoire is #1 grower of cashew nuts in the world in 2020. A high level of exports, stock estimated somewhere around about 100,000 tons. It may be a little bit less than that. I think there is stock with processors which could possibly be resold as RCN, because clearly you can see what's reported as purchased by processors. This 97,000 tons doesn't really correlate with the exports of cashew kernels. That would suggest there's 60,000 tons of stock with processors. To bring them through until the new crop in February, March seems a little bit excessive. So it'll be interesting to see how that transpires. Balances elsewhere, Guinea-Bissau, as I suppose was often mentioned earlier in the year on these events, is run into difficulties. There is stock in Guinea-Bissau that's unshipped. Similarly in Nigeria. Elsewhere, there are probably, in every country, some volumes of RCN that haven't been shipped. Some of that will get shipped in 2021. Some of it, unfortunately, will get mixed. It could be very negative to the sector in West Africa if there was too much mixing of old crop and new crop when the new season begins. If we look at some of the supplies again to Vietnam, during 2020, you can see the grey bars 2019, the orange bars are 2020. This is the position at the end of September. And you can see that the shipments to Cote d'Ivoire are significantly down, although there will have been shipments still to be made in October and shipments that were shipped in September that haven't yet arrived. Ghana, similarly, shipments down. Nigeria, similar situation. Tanzania was up. There was a major purchase by the TNT Group at the end of 2019. So the arrivals in Vietnam reflect the situation in West Africa. And this is the reason why part of the shipments are down and why there are remaining stocks. I would say that in previous years, in 18 and 19, there were continued shipments from West African countries until December, where people had slowly come to market or maybe speculated, hoping for higher prices. Look at the Indian situation. This is a comparison of Indian, now it's full year 2019 versus 8 months of 2020. So it's just to give us an indication. And you see a similar situation. Shipments, purchases by Indian processors from Cote d'Ivoire are very well down. Slightly down for Ghana. And essentially what you see is a heavy purchasing early in the year from Tanzania and much lighter engagement by Indian buyers as their coronavirus crisis, the lockdown, continued. Now, it's important to remember, for example, that some of these figures are distorted. Benin, for example, is distorted. So in 2020, India's imported 127,000 tons from Benin, which is about, there or thereabouts the size of the crop. In 2019, the figure was 168,000. Nobody's quite sure why, but it's probably that material from other countries was routed through Benin, through Cotonou for export. So Benin really did quite well in 2020. Ghana, I would say, similarly in their exports to India. So what you're seeing is Indian buyers coming to market quite early, building an inventory, focused on quality. So focused on the quality they buy in Benin, the quality they buy in Ghana, and then waiting. And it was the countries that were, let's say, much more, lower quality and later to the market that tended to see their exports to India suffer in 2020. Other factors, I think the drop in figures in Guinea probably actually reflects the position in Guinea-Bissau, product routed through Conakry. as happens throughout Africa, cross-border trade has a big impact on trade records. So in conclusion on India, I don't see India coming to market for any major volumes. I hope that demand in India will finish the year strong, but we don't know. We'd be particularly looking at demand for brokens. Demand for wholes has held up reasonably well throughout the year, but demand for brokens has been under pressure. If that returns, then we would see a spike in demand from India, but I don't think that will translate into additional demand for RCN in the coming months. We look at East Africa, the current harvest area, and we see a return to a very positive trend in Tanzania. Crop estimate is up by about 20%, somewhere in the region of 280,000 tons is estimated, somewhat off the record. I think the record was 313,000 tons, somewhat off that, but nonetheless returned to a very positive trend, which is likely to continue. Reports are that about 25% of the crop is in, which is quite good for the time of year, and 60,000 tons has been sold, which I would say in this market is very good. Prices, 980 to 1050 ex warehouse. Resellers, well, there are resellers, $1450, $1480, $1,500, I think, which is a tight enough calculation based on the auction prices. Based on last week's auctions and previous auctions, nobody's making a killing out of Tanzania as they might have been expected to do some years ago. Mozambique, I frankly confess I am confused. I've read an official estimate of the crop at 173,000 tons. I cannot understand how that's possible. Prices have started similar to last year, but we see continued difficulties for processors in Mozambique. There are difficulties in finance, there are difficulties in marketing, and I think that unfortunately we're probably looking at another quite difficult year for processors in Mozambique, and hopefully they will emerge from that in 2021. With regards to the official estimate of the crop, I frankly don't go with that. I think it's much lower than that. And I think there will be disruption to the crop. And I also would say it's probably a little bit too early to draw too many conclusions as to how the situation will fare in Mozambique. Today is, by the way, election day in Tanzania. We are seeing elections also in West Africa in the coming days, and it'll be interesting to see if those have any impact on cashew policy in the coming years, in the coming months, and indeed in the coming years. So the general positive trend in harvests continues, and the general trend in supply chain difficulty, but nonetheless managing quite positively, continues. We look at, I don't like to talk about winners and losers too much, but this is just a way to express to you some thoughts on how the year has gone. Winners in 2020, the African processors, West African processors especially, that managed to stay open, that managed to work, have done well. Buyers, particularly European buyers, have shown more and more interest in engaging in the supply chain in West Africa. There's been some good business. If you've got your food safety, if you've got your supply chain organized, processes in Cote d'Ivoire, Benin have every opportunity to do well, Ghana, Burkina, right across the sector. Retailers did very well so far. Volumes are up right across the sector, wherever you look, particularly formal retail. Supermarkets in the West, supermarkets in North America have done very well on cashews. Vietnamese processors did well. They would have entered the year with a heavy sales book at quite attractive prices. And that turned into low-cost raw material, and they should have done well out of that. Supply chain managers, roasters, importers have all done well because volumes are up, prices are down. This is a much easier situation. There is perhaps one or two caveats in there. I suspect people have had some quality difficulties this year. Generally, the quality of RCN was lower. There may have been some difficulties on quality, but in general terms, it should have been quite a good year for people who move the cashews from the processor to the retailer. If we look at the losers in 2020, you'd have to say that farmers have not had a good year, especially in Africa. Prices were low or lower. The lack of an infrastructure caused the quality to decline if it was left on the farm or locally, and this also impacted their prices. They got less money, they had to wait longer for it. Not a great year to be a farmer of cashews. Now, I should put that in a context, perhaps. It's been a pretty good year to be a farmer in cashews for a long time. People talk about low prices in 2018 and 2019, but let's not forget that farm gate prices have actually trebled over the last 15 years. Volumes have increased. So farming cashews has been a good activity. Just 2020 wasn't a great year. The African processors that closed missed a big opportunity. This really was, if you were in West Africa as a cashew processor, this was a great chance to make a mark in the markets, to demonstrate that shorter supply chains make sense, to demonstrate that African processors can do the job, but some have lost that opportunity. Indian processors have had a very difficult year. The lockdown, the disruption to the market, the disruption to the supply chain has made it incredibly difficult to be a cashew processor in India in 2020. Anyone who stocked pieces, I mean, the fall in the price of cashew pieces was, I can't say entirely unexpected, but it's gone much lower. I mean, virtual panic stations from some processors offering, essentially dropping prices for a product which wasn't going to sell anyway, and continually dropping the price caused hardship all around for anyone who hadn't got good markets for their pieces. And I think that's probably one of the big lessons over the last 18 months for processors, especially new African processors. Make sure you have a market for pieces. Make sure you have a regular market for pieces. Sometimes it's more important to move the stock to make sure it's sold rather than to hold out for a better price. Indian exporters, I mentioned Indian exporters who are also Indian processors, simply because export of cashew kernels from India, as I said, is down by about 23%. Serious impact on that business, and it is difficult to see how that will recover. To compete with Vietnamese processors anytime is difficult, but to compete these days is almost impossible, and it looks like Indian exports will continue to decline. And finally, RCN traders, not particularly because of trading conditions or lost margins or speculation, but simply because lower volumes. So if you're in the RCN business, lower volumes, maybe the consolidation of some of the trade in bigger hands amongst strongholders has caused some of the traders a tough time. I think any one of these actors in the chain would hope for a better year in 2021. And given demand patterns, there's every reason to think that might happen. So let's have a quick look then at the outlook. What has happened is that RCN has moved from weak holders to strong holders. It's either now with traders, importers, or processors, much stronger holders, and that caused prices to spike up, as you've seen, no doubt, over the last few weeks, with then softening over the last 10 days or so. The supply of RCN could get tight if demand stays at levels that we've seen so far this year, which is effectively about 12%, exports up about 12% from Vietnam. Demand is fundamentally strong. It will exceed 2019 in 2020, and I believe in 2021 it will grow again as lower prices and inbuilt trends in consumer demand continue to impact the market. Indian demand is recovering. We'll see how that goes. we'll know after the season, after the festival season. I think it's important to note that the strength in demand is not simply due to COVID-19. I've mentioned this a couple of times. It would be easy to say that strong demand is a result of the pandemic. It's not. It's the result of a long-term trend which will continue. We shouldn't forget this supply chain. I've said this many times in this event over this year. This supply chain is fundamentally flawed. So we're likely to see further late shipments. We're likely to see defaults on kernels contracts that were made at low prices. And as long as we continue to ship 2 million tons of RCN halfway around the world, we're going to see continued disruption and continued volatility in the market. The recessions, it's actually important to mention this, I think, that we're likely to see a recession. The second wave, we're likely to see a recession. We're in a recession. The second wave, many economists say, will have a much bigger impact economically than the first one. And that it's important to recognize that, generally speaking, even the deepest recession has not had a major impact on cashew demand in the past. Going back to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, certainly the trade in 2008 was impacted, early part of 2009, but there was a boom in demand in 2010, 2011, and 2012, actually causing prices to spike up at that time too. So we should bear that in mind. We need to keep an eye on the outcome of elections in a number of African countries and how that might influence the general political and economic environment, and also longer term how it might impact on the cashew policy in those countries. So where we are now is we're in a situation of strong demand, relative balance in supply, perhaps with some reserves. By no means can you say that supply and demand is either strongly one way or the other. What we can say is that demand is likely to continue strong, and we need to keep a close eye on the impact of the second wave of coronavirus, particularly in economies in Europe and in the United States. In Asia, if past experience is anything to go by, this looks like quite a good management of the crisis. But in our part of the world, that's a completely different story. That's the situation as I see it at the moment. It has become clearer as the year goes on. I think we should take a lot of lessons from 2020. The primary lesson is that this difficult, long, untraceable supply chain is likely to cause us further problems anytime there's any hint of disruption. But I think also we should take the lesson that the strength in demand is likely to continue. And that is a very positive sign for the cashew business. And finally, for African processors, I would like to say that lessons from 2020 would be that if you can get yourself in a position where you have supply, where you have a good food safety practice in your premises, and you have good connection to markets, even in the direst crisis, you can actually do quite well. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I've got a slight internet problem here. I hope you've been able to hear everything, but I'll leave the video off. Happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Jim. Very insightful as always. And now let us take the Q&A session. Jim, I would like to start it as there are more questions pouring in, but then I will come to that later. I see that from your presentation, there is a strong trend in the kernel demand, especially in the US and EU, and then also kernel shipments from Vietnam to those destinations. But then at the same time, there is also, RCN imports are down by about 15% from Vietnam. RCN imports also getting into India is also even more than 15% down. And the question for me, especially when I look at your winners and losers, especially at the losers in 2020, where you are talking about farmers and RCN traders, the question that comes up is, where are the stock being held? I know that you've talked about Guinea-Bissau and Cote d'Ivoire, but particularly at what level? Is it at the farmer level? Is it at the bonded warehouses only? Or is it also being held by traders? And maybe if you can clarify this before we move on. Thank you.
I think in African countries, the infrastructure deficit means that what we calculate as stock may in fact be product that's lost. And we won't know that till time goes on. There would be material stocked by traders. I would say in Africa, there's no doubt in Guinea-Bissau that a lot of the material is not stored in ideal conditions. I'm sorry, I have an internet problem. I can't start my video.
Okay, I just go on once.
I don't have the bandwidth on it.
Please go on with the audio, please.
So the situation is that in countries like Guinea-Bissau, there is an infrastructure deficit. So that the raw cashew nut balances, and I say it as balances rather than stocks because we don't really know where it is. That may be held on farm, it may be held in poor quality storage. Similar situation probably to a certain extent across the region. More likely that stocks are held in secure warehouses in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, than in Guinea-Bissau. More likely that they're in poorer quality warehouses in countries where the cashew infrastructure is less developed. In an ideal situation, you'd like to see an infrastructure, whether it be for export or for processing, where there would be a good quality warehouses with the capability to store cashew nuts for a long period. The nuts don't lose value in terms of being stored. They can still be used for processing. So it's important to have that infrastructure to protect in times of crisis. And I would suggest that that is an area for immediate action by governments across West Africa.
Thank you very much, Jim. Given these losses, as you put it, or even stock that are being held, is it likely, or are they likely to affect the prices, especially with also East Africa season starting? Are we going to see a further slump in the raw cashew nut prices, or they will recover to some extent?
Predicting raw cashew nut prices is got to be the most dangerous thing anyone can do. But I don't believe that we'll see a particular slump. I mean, what has to happen eventually is that RCN prices come into line with kernels prices. I think that the chances of a major fall in kernels prices are very limited. And therefore, I think we'll see a steady market, but I'm not expecting any major improvements in prices.
Okay, thank you. Jim, you also mentioned widening price gap for kernels obtained by the top processors vis-a-vis the low processors. What is accounting for this? Is it the volumes they are exporting, or it is established market linkages they have, or what? What exactly is accounting for this widening gap between prices that top processors?
Well, the gap between a top processor and a small processor, it broadens and narrows throughout the year. So normally, if buyers expect that prices will rise, or that they might rise sharply, or if they're buying for forward positions, they tend to be more encouraged to buy from top processors. So that means that they will ultimately have to pay a higher price. So in cashews, if you're buying forward from a top processor, usually with a higher food safety certification, you will pay a higher price. The gap can close for a number of reasons. One is the view of buyers on the current situation in the market and how it might go forward. Two, it can be that the smaller processors may be finding it difficult to process volumes. And right now, smaller processors in Vietnam may be experiencing that, where they're finding that their cost of processing and their access to raw material is limited or more costly, and therefore they need to mark up their prices. So when the smaller processors mark up their prices, naturally the gap closes. And that can be a signal that generally prices are tending on an upward trend. Other times, when the top processors start to mark down their prices, normally they're better connected to the market and they have a better read of it, it can be a signal that the market is about to enter into a downward trend. Essentially, we often talk about it, and especially with markets where importers are important, what's the incentive of the buyer to take a chance on a small processor? How are they likely to take a risk? So they're very unlikely to take a risk on a small processor if they expect prices to go up sharply. Much more likely to do so if they expect the market to be steady or to fall. It also depends on who's buying. Many buyers, perhaps most buyers today, are highly focused on food safety, and they will need to buy from companies with good certification. Smaller processors tend to have lower levels of certification.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Just to pick also some of the questions that are there in the Q&A, how important or how significant is the RCN market in the Middle East? Are we having significant volumes heading for the Middle East in terms of RCN?
The RCN market in the Middle East?
Which is surprising, but then that is what the demand is coming. The question is, please highlight the demand market for RCN in Middle East. Like
okay,
Dubai.
So there are many traders of RCN in the Middle East, particularly in Dubai, but they're buying obviously for destination markets in India and in Vietnam in general. So you would expect that the trends in India and Vietnam would be similar to the trends in the Middle East. If we're talking about kernels in the Middle East, we did see a sharp decline in demand in the early part of the year. But if I look at shipments over the last months, and if I look at shipments for the entire year from the two major processors, we've seen quite a sharp recovery in demand in the Middle East. I might just clarify one thing. You may well see, if you look at import figures to India, you may well see significant imports from UAE, for example, into India. But that is not because the goods are from UAE, that is because someone has routed the goods through certain ports. Just to clarify that if you're looking at some of the figures.
There is a question now who is talking, somebody also writing on the Q&A talking about Bangladesh. How much of a game changer is Bangladesh getting into production of cashew nuts? Apparently the government has taken a decision to cultivate more cashew nuts and even to expand about 100,000 hectares of land into cashew nut production. So the point is that how important is it, or how much of a game changer is Bangladesh?
Well, Bangladesh is a very small producer of cashew nuts at the moment. I'm not sure whether or not cashew nuts is the answer for agriculture in Bangladesh. It would seem logical that if Bangladesh is producing cashews, that they would process them and that they would probably export to their regional markets. 100,000 hectares is a big project. It's a long, long way away. I wouldn't expect that to have any imminent impact on the market. And even if we, took a kind of African average yield, 500 kilos a hectare, 50,000 tons, is not going to make a huge difference in the short term. Maybe there is a business opportunity there, and I would think that that would be quite interesting. And perhaps if they can establish cashew plantations, there's an opportunity to process.
Thank you, Jim. You mentioned Cote d'Ivoire making a record crop this year, and the question that is coming up is that accounted for by the factors such as the closure of the borders, which limited cross-border trade, obviously, or it is as a result of increased yield based on programs they have put in place over the years? What would you say? What would be your take on this? What is accounting for the record crop in Cote d'Ivoire this year?
Sorry, Ernest, could you repeat that question?
Yes, so I'm saying that you had mentioned in your presentation, and actually we do also see a record crop in Cote d'Ivoire this year. So the RCN is hitting levels beyond 800,000.
Yes, okay, I'm with you now, yeah. Yeah, okay, so I think that
These are accounted for by factors such as the reduced cross-border trade as a result of the closure of borders and the rest due to the COVID measures, or it is as a result of increased yield and other measures they are put in place to grow the crop in the country.
Well, I mean, the closure of the border doesn't actually impact the production. It impacts is how the trade is recorded. This year, there's no doubt that the cross-border trade was significantly reduced. It is, after all, illegal trade, and it has been significantly reduced, and therefore we get a better read on the statistics. I think that there has been a good crop. I think in other years there have been good crops. Last year was not one of the better years. I would say this is a combination of easier to record figures due to the absence of the border trade, improved yields, and of course ongoing extension. We had predicted back in 2016 in the forecasts for the Côte d'Ivoire crop, we had predicted 800,000 tonnes from 2019 onwards. So it's not altogether surprising, but it's good to see.
Thank you. By the way, you had mentioned the lack of clarity with some data from Mozambique, and I just want to inform the viewers and listeners that the next edition of the Global Market Encounter, we will have also input from stakeholders in Tanzania and Mozambique to tell us exactly what is happening in the sector, and then also to feed in terms of the dynamics on the ground. But then you had talked about politics in West Africa, and also the fact that today we have elections in Mozambique. How generally are you expecting these elections to impact on the cashew sector this year, and also based on also your experience from previous years, how it did impact on the sector?
Well, I don't expect that governments will necessarily change, regardless of the outcome of their elections. That governments or future governments will change their emphasis on the cashew sector. We see certain countries developing highly regulated systems that offer incentives for investors, perhaps, and for processors. Examples would be Côte d'Ivoire, for example, has a highly developed system which appears to have been effective in stimulating investment in processing. We know that Ghana, Benin, and others are looking at developing perhaps not same systems as Côte d'Ivoire, but regulatory systems for their sectors. I think the most difficult part for any government is the regulation of the RCN. Minimum prices might seem attractive, but they can cause as many problems as they solve. I think that we have to be particularly careful developing marketing mechanisms, auctions, warehouse receipt systems. You know, it's important to consider what the effect of these is. It's important to analyze whether systems that have already been established have actually benefited farmers in a way that they would or might have already benefited from the movements in the market. The cost of these systems, the bureaucracy, all need to be looked at. I would expect to see African governments to continue to support the cashew sector, and I think that we will see an emphasis on the development of value-added systems, particularly cashew processing, but also the management of byproducts. And that, I think, 2020 was a near miss for cashews. If Vietnam had got badly affected by coronavirus, it would have been disastrous in West Africa. We need to take that lesson and prepare a more robust marketing system that adds value on its own.
Thank you very much, Jim. Staying with East Africa, let me also note that it's rather in Tanzania the elections is taking place, as you had mentioned earlier. But then the questioner is asking here, why is it that Kenya is less focused in the East Africa cashew sector discussion. So more or less, we are not focusing more on Kenya, especially taking into consideration that it's the only country in East Africa that imposes an RCN ban. But the second segment of the question is talking about why countries are reluctant to impose RCN ban. Given the situation today in the sector in Africa and globally, is it the right policy measure to go about imposing bans on the RCN exports?
Okay, so firstly, Kenya is not particularly discussed at these forums simply because of the size of production in Kenya. We have limited time. We have to make the best use of it. So we look at areas where there's a focus. East Africa right now, we have crops in Tanzania and Mozambique. They're big crops, so that's why we focus on those. If we look at the ban on RCN exports, in my opinion, if you ban the export of RCN in a country that has a deficit of processing capacity, you will see a collapse in farm gate prices. Banning RCN would only damage farmers. If you imagine a country, any country that's a major processor, a major producer, and a small processor, what would happen? It's incentive for illegal trade, it's incentive for lower prices. So it's not the appropriate action at this time in any market that's got a big difference between the amount of cashews produced and the amount of cashews processed.
So just a follow-up question to this one. Looking at the situation currently and also the outlook you have given, what would be the key recommendation to governments in Africa, especially policy recommendations, particularly to the CICC? One or two policy measures that they should be promoting, looking at the situation today and then also looking into the future. Okay,
so look, it's not my place to tell African governments what to do or even to suggest unsolicited what they might do. What I would say is that what's been effective has been positive incentives for value addition, improvements in quality of raw material, which in cashews can mean long-term factors like improvements in variety, but also much more accessible factors like improvement in post-harvest handling, farmer training, and development of infrastructure. It's, to my mind, very important that governments generally, when they regulate the sector, recognize what the strengths of their sector is. So if it's quality, for example, in Benin, or if it's timing of the crop, it's important that the governments make policies that don't disturb those competitive advantages. I think if I could say any one thing, I would say the tying of regulation to good market information and understanding is essential.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe the last question. There is a question here about how the organic cashew market is faring after COVID.
It's faring well. Demand is good. We see continual inquiries from prospective buyers of organic cashew kernels. The growth in the market is steady, but growth is limited by a reduction in supply. It's important to recognize that the organic market is nonetheless quite a small market, and it is not the answer. Just simply saying we will grow all our cashews organically at this moment in time is not the answer, because that would you would just find effectively that the premiums would be undermined. But it is an important solution for part of production, and it is increasing. It would not be surprising if the organic cashew market over the next 10 years grew, provided the supply is available, that it would grow strongly, provided the supply is available.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot. Probably the last question you talked about in terms of what we have seen so far is a shift from weak traders to weak holders to strong holders. Then there is also a question here by one of the participants who wants to know, were there any consolidations is it that there are leading ASEAN traders that consolidated in the year? Or probably we could also be looking at the kernel level, where there are also kernel buyers or kernel processors that consolidated also in the course of the year to be able to have a better advantage on the market.
Consolidation, what we did see was we saw exit over the past 2 years of a number of traders, some of them new to the market, some of them in the market for a long time, who exited the market following the volatility of 2017 to 2019. And in that sense, you might see a certain amount of consolidation. We've seen the TNT group grow in its operations in raw cashew nuts. And we've seen the advent over the past 3 years of the big government-sponsored deal with TNT. We've seen that in Tanzania. We've seen it in Cote d'Ivoire. We've seen a version of it in Guinea-Bissau that didn't work. We have seen some organization of exporters we've seen that in Cote d'Ivoire. I would say the sector remains fragmented. Largely the strong have gotten stronger. Although some of the strong companies who did not perform well in our cashew nuts have exited. So at this moment in time, fewer traders, some bigger traders, and generally a reduction and rationalization in the sector, but far from a situation where you could describe it as rationalized.
Thank you very much, Fitzpatrick. We have covered all the questions so far. This session was intended to be a very short one and not to pick any inputs, as I mentioned. And so it's been a pleasure having you and to take us through all this. For the next fortnight, we will be looking at markets and the Southern Hemisphere crops. And here we'll be taking a lot of input from East Africa. We are looking at Tanzania. We are also looking at Mozambique. And probably we might get somebody from Kenya to also let us know what is happening with the crop there. So thank you once again, Jim Fitzpatrick. And thanks also to our participants who have been with us right from the beginning, joining us here in on Zoom and also on MS Teams and then YouTube. So we'll continue to come your way every fortnight. So for this year, we have 2 more sessions outstanding. And as I said, the next session is more on markets and the Southern Hemisphere crop. And then we will have a last session. And from there, we move on to next year, where we will do a pause in January and then restart from February and then go again, bringing to you all the information you need to take better business decisions and to make sure that your businesses grow. So we come your way again on the 11th of November, which is the next fortnight. I say a goodbye to you all, and please keep your questions and comments coming, and we will direct them to Jim Fitzpatrick so that they will be taken into account in the next session. Thank you very much, and see you again. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now. Get your copy of the ACA Cashew Barometer. To access diverse industry data like RCN statistics comprising land area, yield data, RCN production volumes, CFR and farm gate prices, volumes of traded RCN. You can also have kernel statistics such as volumes of raw cashew nuts processed, quantities of kernels traded, and FOB prices. With the premium edition, you can view your chart in so many ways using Excel filters. In addition to this, you also have access to cashew heat and policy maps covering RCN policies in different cashew producing countries, processing policies, and map of African producers and beyond. Get your copy now of African producers and